The Tyranny of Words, Part 2, by Dr. Ron Kapp, M.D. Foreword. In Part 2 of this series of scientific essays, Dr. Kapp talks about how the disjointed integration between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system leads to the limbic system running out of control and causing stress. Dr. Kapp, in his research on aging and disease, identifies stress as the major producer of both illness and aging. I will offer my summary at the end. Optimal brain wellness requires that the prefrontal cortex is appropriately communicating with the more primitive neurons of the limbic system. Additionally, there is also a lack of synaptic integration between the hippocampus, the primary memory center, and the prefrontal cortex, cognitive processing. As outlined in Part 1, the common psychiatric imbalance of being unable to logically evaluate, debate, and discuss reality is severely impaired in many people. In essence, this impairment prevents the prefrontal cortex from communicating with the more primitive brain functions of emotions, the limbic system, that drive species survival. This disjointed brain physiology leads to many medical and psychiatric illnesses, all of which are manifest via a lack of empathy for others, a focus on the self-emollient of ego only, and a complete inability to examine and potentially alter ingrained beliefs that have been proven illogical and false. This quirk of genetic evolution has profound implications for personal health. It is an obvious medical truism that when the human organism is in fight or flight mode with an overactive autonomic nervous response, increased epinephrine and norepinephrine release, that the cortisol response of the adrenal glands is also in overdrive. This is the classic stress response so well described by the Hungarian physician Hans Selye in his 1964 book, The Stress of Life. His theory, known as the General Adaptation Syndrome, has been proven valid not only by Selye when he was a research endocrinologist at McGill University, but also by hundreds to thousands of peer-reviewed, published scientific studies. In other words, stress kills. Many experts are of the opinion that stress can be implicated in the etiology of over 90% of all human illness. Consider hypertension and cardiovascular disease, or endothelial disruption and gastrointestinal illness, or metabolic derangement and type 2 diabetes and obesity, or hypothalamic pituitary imbalance with such diverse impacts as anxiety, depression, insomnia, and so on. Chronic stress comes in many forms. It is defined as chronic demands that threaten to exceed resources. From a biological perspective, this is most commonly from an environmental stress, such as poor nutrition, poor sleep, various toxicity exposures. But modern society adds on such stresses as family, work, financial, housing, health, and even CNN and Fox News. Prolonged activation turns into a pathological state. A normal response over a long time frame wreaks havoc on our cardiovascular, our neuroendocrine, and immune systems. Wellness, longevity, and optimal brain performance demand homeostasis. Homeostasis is all about survival. We have an acute stress response, and it is normal. To avoid being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger requires a strong stress response. However, once the tiger is avoided, the acute event is over. Stress dissipates, and the organism returns to a homeostatic baseline. Homeostasis refers to the condition that all physiologic parameters be maintained within a narrow range. However, that does not happen when stress becomes a chronic driver of personality and behavior. Everyone knows that chronic stress kills, but why? The why is answered by the concept put forth by Sterling and Iyer, known as allostasis. The biology of allostasis refers to the adjustments that the human body makes to any challenge over the entire lifetime of the organism. Adapting to a challenge demands the synchronous activation of many systems: neuronal, hormonal, and immunological. Allostasis begins in the brain and requires the integration of both limbic and prefrontal neurons. Each of us responds to an event in an individualized and unique manner based on ingrained beliefs and experiences. For example, as an ER doctor, I see blood and respond one way, whereas the patient sees blood and responds differently. Same blood, different response. Allostasis is about how we interpret a situation and how we adapt. Such individualized adaptations are the key to how chronic disease develops over many years. In other words, our allostatic response to stress can become deleterious over time, irreversible if prolonged, and even lead to premature death. Stress that continues year after year leads to disease. That is obvious and well proven. When the human body does not return to homeostasis and equilibrium, then the adaptations that the body makes will, without exception, cause cellular damage. In other words, allostasis can become detrimental. Therefore, measuring the amount of continued and chronic stress that results from stressful situations when the body fails to adapt, fails to shut off acutely aroused systems, or when the response is deficient, will cause disease. This is known as the allostatic load. When the allostatic load builds up and causes irreversible cellular damage, that is known as allostatic overload. The result is chronic disease, and also such physiological distresses that result in obvious insomnia, anxiety, depression, or sometimes even suicide. Enter the doctors with an armamentarium of pills and potions that include anxiolytics, antidepressants, beta blockers, anti-diabetic medicines, sleeping pills, or even anti-fat pills. It matters not, for these modern miracles do work. These secrets of science work by a multitude of mechanisms to modulate the activity of the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system and attempt to reestablish homeostasis of the patient. Unfortunately, most come with significant side effects, deleterious long-term consequences, and sometimes even death. This is nothing new. Even Voltaire wrote, "Despite the fact that the patient was seen by the best medical minds in Europe, he survived." The one pill, one disease allopathic solution does work well, albeit with the ubiquitous side effects and the deleterious consequences. However, 21st century medicine has moved on and now offers a far different solution. The revolutionary concept of functional medicine asks the fundamental question of why is this patient sick in the first place, and what are the root causes? That is a much different analysis than asking what pill should I give this patient. Patients are not deficient in acetaminophen or Tylenol, or display a penicillin deficiency or lack an antidepressant like Zoloft. Far from it. Patients have a root cause of illness that has impacted their homeostatic balance, affected their allostatic load, and perhaps, most importantly of all, disrupted their neurohormonal connections between the primitive limbic system and their prefrontal cortex. Unfortunately, as a consequence of the tyranny of words, just telling the patients who need this understanding the most will never come to grips with this insidious assault on their health and wellness. The catch-22 of disease has become a downward spiral for millions of Americans, for they block themselves as a consequence of the disease itself. However, for many others, there is great news. There are valid scientific treatments and prescribed modalities that can and do counteract this evolutionary conundrum. Natural products abound. Lifestyle modifications and even modern technology offer humanity a variety of solutions never before available. Enhanced wellness, prolonged longevity, and optimal brain performance is within our grasp. We simply have to open our minds to science, personal change, and opportunity. The challenge is yours. Summary. In my book, A Master's Guide to the Way of the Warrior, I wrote a chapter on the two demons every warrior must face and overcome: pain and fear. These two limbic reactions create what is known as a negative biofeedback loop. Pain creates fear, fear creates stress, and stress reinforces the pain response, and round it goes. Dr. Kapp shows this negative feedback loop on a grander scale that affects the human organism on an ongoing basis, ingraining the negative loop into our organism, which is the root cause of disease, aging, and eventually death. One of the solutions is known as signal dampening, reducing the intensity of both the pain and the stress response. As Dr. Kapp mentioned, this can be done with drugs, such as painkillers and antidepressants. But in addition to all the harmful side effects of these drugs, they also damage the sense organism of the body. A better solution is to integrate the prefrontal cortex, your mind, which can dampen these signals without drugs through various exercises and methods. The good news is that Dr. Kapp has spent the last 20 years researching and developing a program to train the brain that he currently only teaches to medical and health professionals that he calls optimal brain wellness. In the next essay, Dr. Kapp will touch on some of these methods.